The contract had 14 clauses, and not one of them mentioned what to do with my heart. I remember sitting in that office with the leather chairs that smelled like money and old cigars, sliding my finger down the page until I found the line that mattered most. Compensation. A number with more zeros than I'd ever seen attached to my own name. Enough to clear my mother's medical debt, enough to keep the roof over our heads, enough to make the rest of the document feel like a small price. Clause 4. Single heat cycle. Clause 7. Cohabitation during pregnancy for the health and safety of the heir. Clause 11. No romantic or physical contact beyond what is medically or contractually necessary. Clause 12. The one I read 3 times because I couldn't believe anyone would think it needed to be written down at all. This arrangement is strictly business. Both parties agree to maintain professional boundaries throughout. I looked up from the page and found him watching me. Clark Cannon didn't look like a man who needed to buy a mate. He looked like the kind of alpha who could have anyone he wanted just by walking into a room and letting his scent do the talking. That low, wood smoke and cedar thing that made my skin prickle even from across a desk. But apparently the Cannon pack needed an heir with verified, untainted Omega bloodlines, and apparently my family's name, despite everything else we'd lost, still carried that kind of weight on paper. "You understand the terms," he said. Not a question. His voice was the kind that didn't rise or fall, just stayed level, like he practiced not needing anything from anyone a long time ago. "I understand them," I said, and signed my name before I could think too hard about it. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, like a transaction closing, and that was supposed to be the whole of it. A name on a page, a number in a bank account, 9 months, give or take, and then I'd go back to my life, and he'd have his heir, and neither of us would ever have to think about the other again. That was the plan. I want to be very clear, that was the plan. My heat came 3 weeks later, right on schedule, because my body has never once in my life given me the courtesy of being late for something I dreaded. I'd been staying in a guest wing of the Cannon estate by then. Clause 7. Cohabitation, though up until that point cohabitation had meant I saw him maybe twice, both times in hallways. Both times with that same unreadable face, like he was looking through me rather than at me. The estate was enormous and quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I missed the noise of my mother's kitchen, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of her cooking. Here everything smelled like polished wood and money, and faintly, underneath it all, like him. When the heat hit, it hit the way it always did, like a fever made of want. My whole body suddenly convinced that nothing in the world mattered except being filled, being held, being claimed. I'd gone through heats alone before. I knew how to ride them out with a closed door and gritted teeth. But this time there was a knock on my door an hour in, soft, almost hesitant, and I smelled him through the wood before he said a word. Gary. Just my name, low, careful, like he was testing whether I could even hear him over the haze. "I can leave. If you want me to leave, I'll go, and we'll figure something else out for the contract." I remember laughing, a broken, helpless sound, because the idea of him leaving felt physically painful in a way that had nothing to do with logic. "Don't," I said. "Please don't." The door opened slow. He stood in the frame for a long moment, like he was giving me one more chance to change my mind, like he needed me to be the one who said it again. And I did. I said it again. And that was the last clear thought I had for the better part of 2 days. I won't pretend the heat itself was anything but what heats are: desperate, consuming, more instinct than person. But I remember things in flashes that didn't feel like instinct at all. The way he kept asking if I was okay, voice rough but always checking. The way he tucked the blanket back over my shoulder every time it slipped, even in the middle of everything, like some part of him couldn't stand the idea of me being cold. The way he smelled, like he was trying to memorize me. And I remember the very end of it, the last morning when the fever finally broke and I woke up clear-headed for the first time in 2 days, tangled in sheets that smelled like both of us. And he was already awake, sitting up, watching the window like there was something important happening outside, except the sun had barely risen and there was nothing out there but mist over the hills. "Clause 11, I said, because my mouth has never once known when to stay shut, and because some self-protective part of me needed to say it before he could. He didn't look at me right away. "Clause 11, he agreed, voice quiet. Neither of us moved for a long time. The first 3 weeks after that were the worst, because we were both so determined to pretend nothing had happened that the silence between us got a texture, almost a smell of its own, sour and awkward. Sitting in every doorway, we both tried not to walk through at the same time. I confirmed the pregnancy on a Thursday. Sorry, I know everyone starts these things on a Tuesday, but it was a Thursday, gray and drizzling. And I sat on the edge of the guest bathroom's enormous tub, holding a little stick with 2 pink lines on it, and felt my whole chest go tight with something I couldn't name. Relief, because the contract would be fulfilled and my mother's debts would disappear. Fear, because I was 26 and pregnant and living in a house that belonged to a man I'd known for less than 2 months. And something else, something smaller and more complicated that I didn't let myself look at directly. I told him over dinner, which we'd started eating at opposite ends of a table built for 12. Like 2 strangers seated at a wedding who'd been placed together by an indifferent planner. It's confirmed, I said, staring at my plate. I'm pregnant. He went very still. For a second I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Except alphas hear everything. It's part of what they are. Then he set down his fork carefully, like it might break. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. And then, after a pause that stretched long enough, I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole conversation. Have you seen a doctor yet? Not yet. I figured I'll have Dr. Whitfield come by tomorrow. He picked his fork back up. She handled my mother's pregnancies. She's the best there is. You don't have to. I want to. He said it fast, almost sharp, and then seemed to hear himself and softened. It's the air. I want everything done right. The air. Right. I nodded and went back to my plate and told myself the little drop in my stomach was just nerves about the appointment. Dr. Whitfield came the next afternoon. A small, sharp-eyed woman who'd clearly delivered every canon heir for 3 generations and had opinions about all of them. She did the exam in one of the smaller sitting rooms that had apparently been converted sometime in the last 24 hours into something resembling a proper medical space. I noticed the new equipment, the new exam table, and didn't ask how it had gotten there so fast because I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Strong heartbeat, she said after a while, turning a little screen toward me so I could see the flutter on it, fast and steady. Everything looks exactly as it should at this stage. I stared at that flicker on the screen and felt my throat close up in a way I hadn't expected. It was so small, so fast, so real. Can I? My voice came out thinner than I wanted. Can I hear it? She turned a dial and the room filled with this rapid little whoosh whoosh, and I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth because I was not going to cry in front of a stranger, and the man who'd paid for this baby like he was paying for a car. Except when I looked up, Clark wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at me. And his expression, I'd never seen it on him before. Not once in 2 months. It wasn't the careful blankness, the businessman's mask. It was something raw and unguarded, gone the second he noticed me noticing. But I'd seen it. For just a second he'd looked at me like I mattered. I told myself I'd imagined it. The vitamins showed up 4 days later. I found them on the kitchen counter when I came down for breakfast. A little orange bottle prenatal vitamins, the good kind. The kind that costs 3 times as much as the regular ones because they have the extra folate and the omega-3s and whatever else doctors say you need. There was a sticky note on it in handwriting I didn't recognize yet, but would come to know very well. Take with food. See. I stood there holding that little bottle for a long moment. It wasn't a big thing. It really wasn't. Any decent person would have made sure their pregnant whatever I was to him was taking the right vitamins. It was probably Dr. Whitfield's instruction, passed along through a member of staff, and Clark had just been the one to leave the note because he happened to be in the kitchen. That's what I told myself, right up until I found him in the kitchen the next morning and the next, always with a glass of water already poured and set next to the bottle before I even came downstairs, like he'd been waiting. You don't have to do this, I said on the 4th morning, when I found him standing at the counter in a soft gray sweater that made him look about 10 years younger and infinitely less like the man who'd signed Clause 12 into existence. Do what? He didn't look up from the coffee he was making. 2 cups. He always made 2 now, though he drank his black, and mine had to have honey because the smell of sugar made me gag these days, and somehow he'd figured that out without me telling him. This. I gestured at the vitamins, the water, the whole domestic little scene of it. You have staff for this. You don't have to be the one standing here every morning." He was quiet for a second. Then he slid the honeyed coffee across the counter to me, careful, like it was something fragile. "I know I don't have to." That was it. That was all he said. And he didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask because I think some part of both of us understood that if we started pulling at that thread, the whole careful arrangement we'd built, the polite distance, the separate ends of the table clause 11, might come apart in our hands, and neither of us was ready for that yet. So I just said thank you and drank my coffee and didn't look at him too long, because every time I did, that little flicker of warmth in my chest got harder to argue with. The morning sickness hit hard around week 8, and it hit at the worst possible times, never conveniently in the morning despite the name, but in the middle of the afternoon, or right after meals, or once memorably during a video call Clark was taking with some board of directors I never got the full story on. I'd been sitting in on it because Dr. Whitfield wanted me resting somewhere with company, and resting in his study with him working seemed close enough. And then my stomach turned without warning, and I bolted for the bathroom attached to his study with about 2 seconds of notice. I expected him to keep going with his call. I really did. That's what businessmen do, isn't it? Push through, delegate, let the assistant handle the inconvenient pregnant houseguest. Instead, I heard, through the bathroom door, his voice go flat and final. "We'll pick this up tomorrow. Something's come up," and then the soft click of a laptop closing, and footsteps, and a knock on the door so gentle it was almost not a knock at all. "Gary?" His voice, low, careful. "Can I get you anything?" I was kneeling on cold tile, miserable, sweaty, absolutely not in any state to be seen by anyone, let alone the most put-together man I'd ever met. "I'm fine," I managed, which was a lie, and we both knew it. "I'm going to open the door a little," he said. "Just to bring you water. You don't have to look at me." He did. He set a cool glass of water on the floor near my hand and a folded cloth damp that he must have run under the tap. And then, and this is the part I still think about, he sat down on the floor outside the bathroom on the other side of the door frame where I couldn't see him but could hear him breathing. And he stayed there. "You don't have to stay," I said after a while, my voice raw. "I know," he said again. Same 2 words as the vitamins. "I know I don't have to." He stayed anyway, the whole time. And when I finally felt steady enough to come out pale and embarrassed and smelling like I never wanted to smell in front of an alpha, I was apparently, God help me, starting to have feelings for. He didn't say anything about it. He just handed me a fresh glass of water and turned the conversation toward something easy. Something about the gardens, whether I'd seen the roses yet, and let me pretend the last 20 minutes hadn't happened at all. I went to bed that night and lay awake a long time, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing I'd been very carefully not doing for weeks. I let myself think about him. Really think about him. The careful way he held things, like he was always a little afraid of breaking them. The way his voice softened only for me, only ever for me. Like he kept a separate version of himself in reserve, and I was the only one who got to see it. The way he'd looked at that ultrasound screen. I thought about clause 11 and clause 12 and the number with all the zeros, and I thought, not for the first time, that I might be in serious trouble. Week 12 brought the first real conversation we'd had that wasn't about vitamins, doctors, or business. It happened by accident, the way the important things usually do. I'd wandered into the estate's library, an actual library floor to ceiling, the kind of room that exists mostly in old movies, looking for something to read that wasn't a medical pamphlet about trimesters. And I found Clark there in an armchair by the window reading something with a cover so worn I couldn't make out the title. He looked up when I came in, and for once he didn't have that careful, composed look. He looked almost caught. "Sorry," I said, already backing toward the door. "I didn't know anyone was in here." "You don't have to leave." He set the book down, but not before I caught a glimpse of the cover. A battered paperback, the kind with a price sticker from a used bookstore. A cartoon dragon on the front. Not at all what I expected from a man whose desk held nothing but financial reports and contracts. I must have been staring because he looked almost embarrassed, which was a thing I hadn't known his face could do. "It's nothing," he said, reaching to turn it face down on the table beside him. "Old habit." "What is it?" "It's not important." "Clark." I don't know what made me push. Maybe it was the way he'd sat outside that bathroom door for 20 minutes without saying a word about it. Maybe I just wanted for once to know something real about him. What is it? He was quiet for a long moment, and then, like something giving way under pressure, he picked the book back up and held it out toward me. The cover showed a small dragon curled up in an enormous nest, surrounded by a family of much larger dragons who all looked faintly exasperated and entirely fond. My mother used to read it to me, he said. Before bed, every night for years, until I told her I was too old for it. A pause. I wasn't too old for it, I just thought I was supposed to be. I sat down across from him before I'd really decided to. Can I ask what happened to her? She died when I was 14. He said it the way you say things you said 100 times before, worn smooth at the edges, but his eyes weren't smooth at all. After that it was just me and my father, and he wasn't really built for softness. Neither was the rest of the pack, honestly. Everyone kept telling me an alpha doesn't need bedtime stories. An alpha needs to be ready. Ready for what? This. He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, all of it, running everything. Being everything everyone needs you to be and never needing anything yourself, because needing things is… He stopped. I don't actually know how that sentence ends. I think I just believed it for so long I never finished the thought. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, rain had started. Soft against the tall windows in the library smelled like old paper and rain and him. And something in my chest ached in a way I didn't have a name for yet. I think, I said slowly, that needing things doesn't make you less ready. I think it just makes you a person. He looked at me then, really looked, the kind of look that goes all the way down. And for a second, neither of us said anything at all. The rain kept going. The dragon on the book cover kept curling up in its too small nest, surrounded by family that loved it even when it didn't fit the mold. Tell me about your mother, he said finally, quiet. The real one, not the medical history Dr. Whitfield has on file. So I did. I told him about her kitchen and her terrible singing, and the way she used to leave the porch light on for me even when I was 25 years old and perfectly capable of using a key. I told him about the year everything fell apart. The diagnosis, the bills, the slow grinding fear of watching someone you love get smaller. I told him things I hadn't told anyone, not because he asked the right questions, but because for the first time since I'd arrived at that enormous quiet house, it didn't feel like I was talking to a stranger. We sat in that library until the rain stopped and the light went gold and then gray, and somewhere in the middle of it, without either of us deciding to, our chairs had ended up closer together than they'd started. There was one bad night in there that I haven't told many people about because for a long time it embarrassed me, how quickly I assumed the worst, how little it took to send me spiraling back into thinking I was just a line item after all. It was a Sunday evening about a week after the library, and I came downstairs to find Clark on the phone in his study, the door not quite closed. His voice low and businesslike in a way I hadn't heard directed at anyone in weeks. Yes, the timeline is on track. Whitfield says everything looks good. A pause. No, I haven't decided on the nursery arrangements yet. That's still being finalized. The heirs' room will be ready well before the due date. That's not a concern. Another pause, and then, flat, clipped, the voice of the man from that first office. It's being handled. I don't need updates on this every week, Donald. I'll let you know when there's something to report. The heirs' room. The heir. It's being handled. I stood frozen in the hallway with my hand still on the banister and every soft, warm thing that had built up over the last week. The ginger tea, the library, the way he'd held my hand at the ultrasound, felt suddenly like it might have been something I'd imagined. Or worse, something that existed in one world during the day and dissolved the second he was talking to people who mattered, people from his real life, the life this house and this child were actually for. I went back upstairs without dinner. I told the staff I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie, and I lay in bed with my hand on my stomach and cried, quietly, furious at myself for crying, because what had I expected? That a man like that would actually mean it when he looked at me like I was something precious? That this was anything more than him being decent to the Omega carrying his very expensive heir? He knocked on my door around 9. I didn't answer. He knocked again, softer. Gary. Whitfield mentioned you skipped dinner. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said, in the voice that means the opposite. And apparently, even through a door, Even as an alpha who'd spent his whole life being told not to need things, Clark Cannon could hear exactly what fine meant. He didn't come in. I heard him sit down on the other side of the door, the same way he had outside the bathroom weeks before. "You're not fine," he said, quiet. "And I think it might be something I did. So I'm going to sit here, and whenever you're ready, you can tell me what it was. I'm not going anywhere." I don't know how long I lay there before I finally got up and opened the door. He was sitting on the floor of the hallway, knees drawn up, looking up at me with an expression so worried it cracked something open in my chest. "I heard you on the phone," I said. "Earlier, talking about the heirs room, saying it's being handled." My voice wobbled and I hated it, and I know that's exactly what this is supposed to be. I know I'm the one who keeps forgetting that. For a second I forgot, and then I remembered, and it just hurt more than I expected it to. Something in his face went through several things at once: confusion, and then a dawning, horrified understanding, and then something that looked almost like guilt. "That call was with my father's lawyer," he said slowly, "about the legal side of the succession filing. Gary, it's paperwork. Boring technical paperwork about titles and inheritance law, the kind of thing I have to deal with regardless of how I feel about any of it, because that's what being the heir to all this actually means. Endless calls with men named Donald about filings nobody will ever read." He reached for my hand, slow, careful, the way he always was. "It wasn't about you. None of it. I would never talk about you like that. I'm not always good at remembering to leave that version of myself at the office door. I'm sorry it found its way to you." "I overreacted," I said, embarrassed now, in the opposite direction. "You didn't." He said it firmly, like he wouldn't accept any other answer. "You heard something that sounded like the thing you were always afraid of, and you believed it, because I gave you 14 reasons to believe it, in writing, with my own signature on the bottom. That's not overreacting. That's just what I built, and I'm sorry you're still living inside it." We sat on the floor of that hallway for a long time after that, not saying much, just close, his shoulder against mine, until the knot in my chest finally loosened. It didn't fix everything. Not yet, not all at once. But it was the first time either of us had said out loud that the contract was a thing we'd built, and that maybe eventually it could be unbuilt too. After that, things changed. Not all at once, and not in any way either of us announced. There was no conversation where we agreed to throw out Clause 11. No dramatic declaration. It was smaller than that. It was him saving me the last of the ginger tea because he knew it settled my stomach. It was me starting to wait for him at the bottom of the stairs in the evening instead of going straight to my room. It was both of us, slowly, without meaning to, building a life that looked less like a business arrangement and more like... I didn't let myself finish that thought either, for a long time. By week 16, we were eating dinner at the same end of the table. By week 18, he'd started reading to me in the evenings. Not the dragon book, not yet, but other things. Whatever I picked off the library shelves, and his voice in the quiet of that big room did something to my chest. I refused to examine too closely. By week 20, I'd started to notice the vitamins were no longer just left on the counter with a note. He'd started handing them to me directly, every morning, like a small ritual, like something that mattered to him beyond the contract's terms. And one morning when I fumbled the bottle and the little capsules spilled across the counter, he didn't just help me pick them up, he caught my hand first, just for a second, just to steady it. And the warmth of his palm against mine sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with hormones and everything to do with how completely, I had fallen for a man I was supposed to be keeping at arm's length. I pulled my hand back. He let me. Neither of us said anything. But that night, lying in bed, I pressed my palm against my chest where his hand had been and thought, with something between joy and absolute dread, I think I love him. I think I have for weeks. And in a few months, this is all going to end, and he's going to have his heir, and I'm going to have my payment, and none of this version of us is going to survive that. The anatomy scan was at 20 weeks, and it was the day everything tipped over. We sat together in Dr. Whitfield's converted exam room, and she moved the wand slowly across my belly, narrating things in her brisk, kind way. Heart chambers, spine, the little curl of fingers and toes, and then she paused and smiled and said, "Would you like to know?" I looked at Clark. He looked at me. And for the first time, I realized neither of us had ever actually discussed this, whether we'd find out, whether it mattered, whether the heir's gender had been some unspoken condition of the contract I'd somehow missed. Do you want to know? I asked him, quiet. Something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked almost like surprise, like he hadn't expected to be asked, like in his head this had only ever been my decision to make, my body, my choice. I want whatever you want, he said. That's not an answer. A small, almost helpless smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his whole face, made him look young, made my heart do something complicated and painful. Yes, he said, I want to know, if that's all right. It's a girl, Doctor, Whitfield said, and turned the screen so we could both see. This tiny, impossible, perfect shape, curled up and moving, oblivious to the two grown men in the room who had both, very suddenly, gone completely silent. I don't know which of us started crying first. I think it might have been him. I think that's the moment I knew with absolute certainty that whatever Clark Cannon had told himself this pregnancy was for duty legacy, an heir on paper, somewhere along the way it had stopped being about any of that for him, too. He reached for my hand without seeming to think about it, and I let him take it. And we sat there, two grown men crying over a black and white screen, holding hands like it was the easiest thing in the world. A girl, he said, like he was testing the word, like it might break if he said it too hard. We're having a girl. We. He said we. I didn't correct him. I don't think either of us could have, even if we'd wanted to. That night, after Dr. Whitfield left, we sat out on the back terrace with the lights of the garden coming on around us, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all. The air smelled like the roses he'd shown me weeks ago, and like rain that hadn't quite arrived yet, and like him, that low cedar warmth that I'd stopped being able to separate from the word home. Gary. He said my name carefully, like it cost him something. Can I ask you something, and you can tell me if it's out of line? You can ask me anything. When the contract ends. He stopped. Started again. After she's born. What happens then, in your head, I mean? What does that look like for you? I felt my chest tighten. This was the conversation we'd both been avoiding for months, the one hiding underneath every careful moment, every shared cup of tea, every quiet evening in the library. The contract was very clear, payment on delivery, in every sense of the word. I would go home with my money and he would keep his daughter, and that would be that. It was what I'd agreed to. It was what made all of this possible in the first place. I don't know, I admitted, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. I used to know exactly what it looked like. I had it all planned. Take the money, go home, help my mother, never think about any of this again. I looked at him, and the words just kept coming, like a dam breaking. And then I got here and you started leaving vitamins on the counter and reading to me in the evenings and sitting outside bathroom doors for 20 minutes because you didn't want me to be alone. And now I don't know what it looks like anymore. I don't know how I'm supposed to just leave. I don't know how I'm supposed to go back to a life that doesn't have you in it, or her in it. And I hate that I don't know that, because I agreed to know that. I signed a contract that said I'd know that. The silence after I stopped talking felt enormous. I'd said too much. I'd said everything, actually. Every single thing I'd been carrying around for weeks, and now it was just sitting there between us, raw and undeniable. And I had no idea what he was going to do with it. Gary, he said again, and his voice had gone rough in a way I'd never heard before. Look at me. I looked at him. I have spent my entire life being told what an alpha is supposed to want, he said. Power, legacy, an heir preferably without any inconvenient feelings attached, because feelings make you weak, feelings make you negotiable, and a cannon doesn't negotiate. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I signed that contract because it was supposed to be simple. A transaction. I told myself I could keep it simple. And? My heart was pounding so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. And then you came here, he said, and you cried at every sad part of every book I read, and you got so excited about the roses you forgot to be careful with me for almost a full minute. And you held my hand at that ultrasound like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I have never, his voice cracked just slightly, just enough. I have never wanted anything the way I want you to stay. Not the heir, not the contract. You. I want you to stay because I can't imagine this house, or that nursery, or any morning for the rest of my life without you in it." I couldn't breathe. "Clark, I bought the vitamins because I wanted to take care of you," he said, like it was a confession, like it had been weighing on him. "Not because Whitfield told me to. Not because the contract said to. I wanted to be the one who made sure you were okay every single morning for the rest of—" He stopped. And for the first time since I'd met him, Clark Cannon looked uncertain, looked almost afraid. "I know I'm not supposed to say any of this. I know Clause 11 exists for a reason, and I know I'm the one who insisted on writing it. But I don't want it anymore. I haven't wanted it for months. I just didn't know how to say it without making you feel like you owed me something, like staying would be part of the deal instead of something you actually wanted." The garden lights flickered against the dark, and somewhere a fountain was running, and I sat there with my hand pressed to my chest over the place where our daughter was turning slow circles. And I thought about every morning with that little orange bottle, every quiet evening in the library, every time he'd looked at me like I was something precious instead of something purchased. "I want to stay," I said. My voice shook. "Not for the money, not because of the contract. I want to stay because somewhere in the last 5 months, this stopped being an arrangement and started being my life. You're my life. You and her. Both of you. And I don't want to go back to anything that doesn't have you in it either." He reached for me then, slow, careful, like he was giving me every chance to pull away, and when I didn't, when I leaned into him instead finally, after months of careful distance, he wrapped his arms around me like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it, and pressed his face into my hair, and I felt him shake just slightly, with the kind of relief that doesn't have words. "I love you," he said into my hair, quiet, like a secret. "I have for a while now. I just didn't think I was allowed to." "You're allowed," I said, laughing and crying at the same time. "The way you do when something that's been hurting you for months suddenly stops. You're allowed, Clark. You're allowed to want things. You're allowed to need things. I'm not going anywhere." We tore up the contract 2 days later. Not metaphorically, actually, physically, in the fireplace in his study. Both of us sitting on the floor in front of it like teenagers, watching 14 clauses curl up and turn to ash. "Clause 12 was always my least favorite," I said, watching the paper blacken at the edges. "Mine too," he admitted. "I wrote it because I was terrified of exactly this, of wanting something I thought I had no right to want." He nudged the last corner of paper into the flame with the poker, and it went up fast, bright, gone. "I'm glad it's gone." "Me too." I leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around me. "Easy now. Natural, like we'd been doing it for years instead of just days." "What now?" "Now," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head, soft and certain, "we figure it out. Together. No contracts, no business. Just us." I liked the sound of that. I liked it so much I didn't trust myself to say anything else, so I just stayed there leaning against him, listening to the fire and the quiet and the soft, steady flutter of our daughter turning in her sleep, and let myself believe for the first time in months that this, all of it, was finally completely real. The months after that were the happiest of my life. And I say that knowing exactly how it sounds, knowing how strange it is to say about a stretch of time that included swollen ankles, 3-amine, cravings for pickles and orange juice in combinations that made Clark visibly nauseous to even fetch, and a back that ached so constantly I started sleeping propped up on what felt like a small mountain of pillows. But it was true. Every single bit of it was true. We told his father together in the formal sitting room with the portraits of past canons glowering down from the walls like a jury that had already reached its verdict. His father, Edmund Cannon. A tall man with Clark's same careful posture, but none of the warmth I'd learned to find underneath it. Listened to the whole thing with his hands folded and his face giving away nothing at all. The same way Clark's used to before the library, before the roses, before everything. "Let me understand," Edmund said when Clark finished. "You're telling me the arrangement has changed, that the Omega," he didn't look at me when he said it, "is no longer simply fulfilling the contract, but is, what? Staying. Permanently. As your mate." "His name is Gary," Clark said, and his voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before, quiet and absolutely immovable. "And yes, That's exactly what I'm telling you. You understand what this means for the succession filings. For how the Pack Council will view, I understand exactly what it means. Clark didn't raise his voice, but something in the room seemed to go very still, the way a forest goes still before weather. It means my daughter will grow up in a house where both her parents actually want to be there. It means I'm not going to spend the next 60 years the way you spent the last 30 alone, in a house full of people who work for you, telling yourself that's the same thing as having a family. I watched you do that. I am not doing that. Edmund's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tick of an old clock on the mantel, and I found myself holding my breath, my hand instinctively moving to rest over the curve of my belly, like I could shield Ren from whatever came next just by covering her with my palm. He's the one who's been with me through all of it. Clark went on quieter now, and when he looked at me his whole face changed the way it always did. Soft in a way I don't think his father had ever seen before. He held my hand at the ultrasound. He cried with me when we found out she was a girl. He's the reason I know how to do any of this, how to be ready for her, how to not just survive being a father, but actually want it. He looked back at Edmund. I love him. That's not a negotiating position. That's just true. And I would rather lose every single thing this family has than lose that. I don't think I'd ever seen Edmund Cannon look surprised before. It didn't last long. He wasn't a man built for lingering in any expression. But for just a moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like he was seeing his son for the first time. Maybe he was. I see, he said finally. And it wasn't agreement, not exactly, but it wasn't the wall of objections I'd braced for either. He looked at me properly for the first time since we'd walked in. Gary, is it? Yes, sir. My son tells me you've been reading Whitfield's reports cover to cover, that you ask better questions about her care than half the medical board does. It wasn't quite a compliment, not in tone, but it wasn't nothing either. I suppose that's something. It's a start, Clark said and reached for my hand right there in front of the portraits and the old clock and his father's careful, unreadable face, and held it like it was the most natural thing in the world, because by then, for both of us, it was. Edmund didn't say anything else. He stood, smoothed down his jacket, and walked to the door, and then, just before he left, paused with his hand on the frame, not quite turning back. Your mother, he said to Clark, would have liked him, and then he was gone, and the door clicked shut behind him, and Clark let out a breath like he'd been holding it for 30 years. Was that good? I asked, a little stunned. I genuinely can't tell if that was good. That, Clark said, pulling me into him, voice thick, was the closest thing to a blessing that man has ever given anyone. Yes, that was good. He pressed his face into my hair, and I felt him laugh, shaky and disbelieving, against my temple. He liked you. He actually liked you. Everyone likes me, I said, mostly to make him laugh again, and it worked. And for a long moment we just stood there in that cold, formal room full of glowering portraits laughing, holding each other, while Ren turned slow circles beneath my ribs like she was laughing too. We told my mother on a video call and she cried so hard she had to hand the phone to my aunt for a full 5 minutes, and when she got it back she just kept saying over and over, my boy is happy. Look at my boy. Until I was crying too, and Clark was sitting beside me with that soft, helpless smile he only ever wore around me. The one that made him look about 20 years younger than the man in the boardroom photographs. We turned one of the guest rooms into a nursery. Not the one I'd been staying in, a different one, sunnier, with windows that looked out over the rose garden, because Clark remembered, without being told, that the roses were the first thing I'd really fallen in love with about this enormous quiet house back when it was still someone else's house and not yet ours. We painted it together, badly, getting more paint on each other than on the walls until we were both laughing too hard to hold the brushes straight. And every single morning, without fail, there was a little orange bottle on the counter and a glass of water. And him, in that soft gray sweater, already smiling before I came down the stairs. You don't have to keep doing this, I told him one morning around week 30, half joking, the way I always did. The way that had become its own kind of ritual between us. I know, he said, and handed me the bottle and pressed a kiss to my temple, soft and warm and completely unhurried, like we had all the time in the world. I want to. Not I have to. Not the contract requires it. I want to. 3 words that had taken 5 months and 1 torn-up contract and more honesty than either of us had ever been brave enough to offer before. And now they came easy every morning, like the most natural thing in the world. Her name is Ren. We picked it together, lying in bed one night with my hands resting on the curve of my belly and his hands resting over mine, both of us feeling the small, insistent flutters of movement underneath. Something small, I said. Something that sounds like it could fit in someone's hand. Ren, he said after a moment, quiet, testing the word the way he'd tested the word girl all those weeks ago. It suits her. Small but loud when she wants to be. How do you know she's going to be loud? Because, he said, and there was so much warmth in his voice I felt it in my chest. She's already kicking like she's got something to say about everything. Wonder where she gets that from. I elbowed him gently and he laughed. Really laughed, the kind of sound that still surprised me every time, like some part of me hadn't fully believed all those months ago in that office with the leather chairs, that this man was even capable of it. She was born on a soft gray morning at the very end of summer in the same converted exam room where we'd first heard her heartbeat with Dr. Tupel. Whitfield's steady hands and Clark's steadier voice, low and constant in my ear the entire time, telling me I was doing so well, that he loved me, that we were almost there, that she was almost here. And when they finally placed her on my chest, small and red-faced and absolutely furious about the whole experience, screaming with the kind of conviction that made Clark laugh and cry at the same time, I looked up and found him watching the two of us with an expression I'd seen only once before in flashes, back at that very first ultrasound, except this time he didn't look away. This time he let me see all of it. The love, the wonder, the disbelief that any of this was real, that any of this was his, was ours. "Hi," he whispered, leaning down, his big hand impossibly gentle against her tiny back. "Hi, Ren. We've been waiting for you." We. There it was again. The word that had started everything, all those months ago on the terrace. The word that had turned a transaction into a family. She's 3 months old now, and the nursery with the rose garden view has become the most lived-in room in the house, full of soft blankets and stuffed dragons. Yes, dragons. Clark has very strong opinions about which books a child should be read before bed, and I have never once tried to argue with him about it. And the kind of warm, milky, slightly chaotic mess that no amount of staff could ever quite keep up with, and that neither of us minds in the slightest. And every morning, without fail, there's still a little orange bottle on the kitchen counter. Different vitamins now. Mine have changed post-pregnancy, something to help with the nights I'm still recovering from, but it doesn't matter. The ritual is the same. The water glass, the soft gray sweater, the kiss to my temple, the quiet I want to that needs no explaining anymore, because we both understand it perfectly. Sometimes in the evenings when Ren is finally asleep and the house has gone soft and quiet around us, I think back to that office with the leather chairs to clause 11 and clause 12, to the man across that desk who couldn't meet my eyes and told me in a voice with no warmth in it at all that this arrangement was strictly business, and I think about how wrong he was, how wrong we both were, how something that started as 14 clauses on a page became, somewhere along the way, without either of us deciding it on purpose, the truest thing either of us had ever signed up for. The contract said nothing about love. It never could have. There was never a clause for the way he looks at me across a darkened nursery, or the way he still, after everything, hands me that little bottle every single morning like it's the most important thing he'll do all day. There was never a clause for any of this. There didn't need to be. Some things, it turns out, you don't put in writing. You just wake up one day and realize they're simply, quietly, completely true, and you spend the rest of your life grateful that they are. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.